with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. This is episode 150. And probably at about episode 87, Tony Middlebrooks looked at me and said, "Has anyone interviewed you yet?" And I kind of filed that back and repressed the thought. And, I saw him a few weeks back at the ILA conference. And you know what? I said, hey, let's try this. Let's provide an opportunity to reflect on what 150 episodes has looked like. Of course, he has been a guest. And he is a clinical professor of leadership at the University of Florida. He spent 17 years at the University of Delaware. He is a co-author of mine, a good friend, a mentor. I was talking about a session he used to do at the ILA about completing your dissertation. And I just thought, oh, Tony Middlebrooks, he is a god of all things dissertations. I love this. I was so impressed. And then I got to know him,
Yeah. If you don't stand on the pedestal, Scott, you don't fall off it.
Tony, I have a quick, funny story to tell you, which kind of sums everything up for our whole conversation. So a friend of mine pulled me aside at the conference when we were at the ILA and wanted to have this kind of intense conversation about Phronesis and the origin of the name. And he started talking about Sophia, and we started getting really kind of deep into wisdom dialogue. And so he spoke for probably about 7 to 10 minutes, squatted in a room, and we were talking. So he got done with this 10 minutes and asked me this kind of very insightful question about wisdom. And I had to look at him and say, you know what? I've always liked just the phrase practical wisdom. I don't know Aristotle well. And you know what? There was really no intentional thought behind the name other than I wanted it to be about practical wisdom. And you could see him get just a little bit disappointed.
Well, I can tell you 150 episodes is probably cause for just a little bit more gray hair in anyone. So there's your practical wisdom.
Exactly. So I had to let him down and say, you know what? I'm not an expert in wisdom, but I ended the conversation by saying, hey, you know what? If you want to come on and talk wisdom, we'd love to hear from you. So we'll see if he chooses to do that. But so today, you are kind of in the driver's seat, and you are going to, we're going to turn the tables a little bit, and, I'll turn it over to you, and we'll see. I never get anxious for this, but I was a little bit anxious for this today. So I'm excited to see where the conversation goes.
Good. Yeah. Then you definitely are in the passenger seat. Yeah. So I prepared quite a few questions because frankly, 150 times, 30, 40 minutes of conversation and wisdom with folks who are very well accomplished in this field, there's got to be lots and lots of interesting stuff in there. And so we'll see what we can pull out in the next 40 minutes. I'd kind of like to ask you the most important question right up front, which is, if Wheaties is the breakfast of champions, what is the breakfast of leaders, Scott Allen?
That would be Cocoa Puffs, Tony, or
Yes.
Cookie Crisp, right? What was going on in the 70s when I was growing up? You were probably a young child then as well. The
Yeah.
cookies for breakfast.
Yeah. Oddly, I continue that trend.
I think
No,
that was a
seriously,
Jerry Seinfeld joke, right? Cookies for breakfast, for real?
yeah, yeah. But in all seriousness, the big reveal question, let's just put the big answer right up front. What would you call this episode? What is the big overall theme that came out of this adventure?
Overall theme. What would I call this episode? What would we call it? You know, the first thing that came to mind for me you had sent me a couple questions, or you didn't send me that one though, Tony Middlebrooks. But one of my answers to one of them was stay curious. And I think there's a word that I've just fallen in love with, which is curiosity. And there's so much in that word. And I think something that's really intimidating about this process, I'm not an expert in all of these things yet. I think we feel like we should be. I thought entering this, I've studied this stuff for 15, 20 years. I know about leadership, but Tony, I was in a conversation this morning recording a podcast and just going to school. I was on the bus, right?
Wow.
And it was just an incredible learning experience. And so curiosity causes you to be vulnerable. It keeps you in a place of wonder. It helps you kind of explore. So I've just fallen in love with this word, curiosity. Maybe I would call the podcast Curiosity next time. That's stay curious, right?
Nice. Very nice. Well, and interestingly, one of my questions for long after the essential ones is this notion that in leadership, we often feel leadership educators, practitioners, scholars often feel compelled to be the expert, right? The little God. We come into an organization and we give advice and we give guidance. And from Tim Harford's TED Talk about trial and error and the God complex, it seems like around every corner, there's a leadership program or a consultant who has that answer for you, the answer. I know you have lots of thoughts on the overall rise of leadership training, but I think the best answer is the one that you just gave, which is prompting ourselves to stay curious. So here's what I'm curious about. Give us the numbers. 150 episodes. I got that. What else can you tell us about this grouping in mass of information that you gathered?
This was actually kind of interesting. And it was a question that forced me to do a little bit of looking, not anything in great depth, but it was kind of telling some of the numbers here. There's 150 episodes, roughly 62,000 downloads. That's 50,000 from North America, 7,000 in Europe, 177 in South America, 1,830 in Oceania, and roughly 300 in Africa, 1,565 in Asia, right?
Wow.
So it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I thought, wow, I mean, who are some folks in South America that I could be having conversations with? Africa, obviously an incredibly large continent with so much opportunity and so many wonderful things happening. So it really helped me frame, and I've had guests from Africa and I've had guests from South America, but obviously nowhere near to the level that we've had from North America or Europe. And I think it kind of in some ways models what we maybe see. It's a fractal of what we maybe see at the ILA, very US centric, then some Europeans, some folks from Oceania, and then there's going to be smaller numbers from South America and Africa. So it's just interesting. Now another kind of fun thing is 141 countries or territories.
Wow.
So that's something I really love saying to my girls. I really am having this little bit of an internal dialogue right now. Should I change the theme song? Because the theme song was just developed. This is another, it was a pandemic project and we had a lot of time on our hands, and I'd watched some videos about starting a podcast and all of them said, look, don't overthink your music. Don't overthink the title. So I came up with practical wisdom.
That's good.
Don't overthink your logo. Just go. And I'd gone to my daughters, who were probably, 9 or 10 at the time, and just said, hey, you want to make a theme song? And they said, yes. And it kind of became an afternoon activity, this silly little thing. Well, it's kind of fun. It's interesting. But 141 countries, it's fun to let the girls know that their voice is being heard all around the world as people consume and take in the content from these just incredible people that I've had a chance to speak with, right?
Yeah. Have you pulled out a world map and kind of put a few pins in there to give them a geography lesson?
We should. We should. I have not.
That's kind of a professory thing to do. Yeah, so most people took on sourdough. You decided to take on a podcast. A little tougher to quit, and I'll be honest, I'm very impressed with your longevity. I mean, it is a lot of work that requires consistent dedication, and they're a lot of fun to listen to, of course. But enough about your praises.
Thank you.
Let's talk about your learnings.
Yeah.
So tell me some themes that kind of in the general sense seem to emerge across the many interviews. We'll get into the weeds a little bit later, but for now, what are some of the ones that maybe surprised you as emergent themes, and then some of the ones you were expecting?
Sure. The overarching theme, I guess, Tony, and I don't really know how to put this into words yet, but the podcast, in some ways, I have a friend who's become a mentor because of this podcast. So he reached out, he was a listener. We now speak every 2 weeks, roughly.
Wow.
I mean, just an incredible guy. And we dialogue a lot. And he loves the podcast. And one thing that he also says about the podcast is, it's all over the place. And leadership is kind of all over the place. I had a couple episodes, great conversation with Andrew Tarvin, Humor That Works. So we talked about comedy, and you can talk about shadow sides, and you can talk about Abraham Lincoln, and you can talk about adult learning and adult development and DEI, and you can talk about so many different transfer of training. You can talk about so many different topics, teams. And when I look at those different topics, it really does. So the whole, and that's really what I can kind of think the master project is here for me, to try and get a better understanding of the major pieces, the big pieces that we have to have on our radar to be successful in doing this work. Is that the expertise literature, right? That's another little nook and cranny that we've gone down.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's probably the largest theme, is from week to week. I hope listeners appreciate the variety, but the variety can also be a little bit of the challenge because there's just so much. Now, obviously, with world events and events that are central to the United States, things like George Floyd's death, his murder, that definitely has been a theme when it comes to the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As we wrote our most recent second edition of the textbook, Tony, that emerged very much more as a theme and something that we focused on. And even I'm kind of amazed, Tony, at as I look back at some of my old classes or even some of the content of our textbook as we were revising, we probably weren't doing a great job of honoring people from different cultures, different ethnicities, different genders in the ways that we need to. I was kind of brought up under this, hey, these are the leaders and these are the examples, and kind of unaware and not putting a critical eye to some of that. So I think that's something that very much is a theme and has come on the radar in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting. I think this topic, you and I were talking about this before we started. I don't know that 8 years ago we would have had followership on our tongues the way that we do now. I don't think that would have been a theme. I don't think that, and I don't know if this is just my own interest or if it's truly a theme, but I've had a lot of episodes around adult development. And some of this thinking around if you have an individual with more evolved levels of mental complexity, this is the Robert Keegan in over our heads. If we have people who are thinking at elevated levels of mental complexity and making sense of systems and holding competing values, dialectical thinking, will they be more successful in these pretty gnarly roles, right? Mm-hmm. So the work of Eigel and Kunert and Robert Keegan and Bill Torbert, and I have a whole series that's going to be coming out that with Jonathan Reams, where we really start exploring that topic in depth as just another nook and cranny of this whole conversation. So I think those are some of the themes, with the larger theme of how do we make sense of this and what are the most important pieces? Because I think that has very real ramifications, Tony, for education.
Right. So it's in many ways this balance between trying to, for you as a leadership educator, practitioner, individual who is suddenly in a leader position, to try to wrestle with that, on the one hand, best fit, and on the other hand, those foundational pieces that maybe apply to everyone.
Well,
Um,
and here's something that I have, again, I don't have a perfect example here. Maybe we could go with a surgeon or a pilot, and even those are imperfect because there just simply aren't the number of variables that exist when you have someone in a position of authority and say, a Fortune 500 organization or a large nonprofit. But I go back to, and we've had some conversations about this and push back on this. I mean, I think it's when I'm going to try and become a pilot, there's a very clear scaffolding process. And when I'm going to become a surgeon, I don't start with hearts. But the first time I touch something, I'm probably on a gallbladder. And then it's about a decade of really intensive education and training that goes into me being in the right seat or the left seat of the 747, or me actually conducting this heart surgery. And then even there, you can start elevating. For me, it feels like at times people are walking into the conversation trying to have 747 type conversations before people have even flown a Cessna. And it's all over the place and people don't have the scaffolding. And so then I think it is totally confusing because just so we aren't clear ourselves on how we scaffold some of this. I go back to the Snowden and Boone. I had them on the podcast and it was a really fun conversation, but they have that famous HBR article and they talk about 4 different types of problems that leaders face: simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. Well, you have a different set of tools and knowledge that is going to help you in each of those 4 categories. And of course, I'm simplifying here, and that's simplifying, but it feels like we're all over the place, and there isn't a sense to how we're scaffolding this topic.
a great observation. And as you mentioned, because there's such a wide variety of folks that you've talked to and the approaches and perspectives they've taken, that can be really overwhelming for anyone who, I'm in a new leadership position and here's a zillion books and a zillion podcasts and a zillion pieces of advice, and how
Yeah.
to kind of wade through all that and as you said, scaffold it, or at least figure out a way to say, here's the basics. Let's start with the basics, and then you can pick your path.
Well, I often think, Tony, this is a real concern. And so I've tried to invite practitioners to the podcast who maybe don't have a PhD in leadership, because I don't know that the average, this is another maybe theme, I don't know that the average leader would find this podcast as practical wisdom.
Uh-oh.
Well, I mean,
Next
I think
150.
they could really, I think it'd be valuable for them to listen to the conversations. I totally do. But
Yeah.
again, some of these conversations, I'm entering at the deep end. I'm swimming and trying to stay afloat. And again, I can see a mid-level manager at company Y or nonprofit G and at somewhere in the world, and it may not feel all that relevant to them, which I think, I don't know. I mean, that's another interesting thing about our work right now as academics, that is our work feeling relevant?
Yes.
I had on a practitioner a few episodes back, a voracious learner. And this was just an interesting observation. His name is Ethan Braden, and I love Ethan and he's awesome. As he was talking about his thought leaders, people he's consuming, there was only one academic on that list.
Yep.
So have the KPMGs, the Deloittes, the Bain, the influencers, the Simon Sinek's, nothing against Simon Sinek, but they have the influence and the voice and the relevance in the marketplace. I think because at times we haven't clearly made sense.
Yeah, those are some of the thought leaders slash influencers that I have been most impressed with. People like Dan Pink, who,
Yeah.
he doesn't do the research, but he translates the research so well into bite-sized practical tips
Yes.
to make not just your leadership better, but your life better, your
Yeah.
professional life.
Yeah. And then when you have like an Adam Grant, who's an insane translator and an awesome academic, I mean,
Right.
that's a really powerful combination. And those are a lot of my really favorite guests, those folks who have the PhD and have the degree, but they're working at Intel or they're working at an organization and really trying to operationalize some of this. I mean, I just really enjoy those conversations.
So let me ask you, were there any folks who, as you interviewed them, made some controversial assertions, things that kind of took you by surprise? How'd you react to that? How'd you personally process it?
I haven't found myself really in controversial situations. I mean, there's been guests with pretty strong opinions about certain leaders, and there's been guests who feel strongly about certain things. And it was interesting. I actually had one listener say, "Hey, would you put a disclaimer on your show notes just suggesting that these guests do not represent truth?" So you might notice around episode, I don't know, 128, there started to become a disclaimer because this person's assertion was, look, all over the world, people might listen to your podcast and assume that some of these perspectives are truth. So that was
Huh,
interesting.
very
But,
interesting.
there have been a couple people who I just love. Snowden and Boone would be in this category, Henry Mintzberg, Kathy Allen. They're at 50,000 feet and they're seeing things in such beautiful, fascinating ways. And I'm not there. I'm not there yet. It's a lot of fun to kind of exist in that space. And I jokingly say this sometimes, Tony, but this is a little secret for listeners. If you ever want to know that if Scott really knows what's going on in the conversation, you'll know that I have no clue what's going on if I say, tell me more.
The classic professor trick.
That means, I'm talking to Elena from Western Ontario and Western University in Ontario, and she's at 50,000 feet, and I'm swimming. But Mintzberg, the episode was called "What's Dumbing Us Down," and he's just thinking about things at such a macro level, and really how our society is out of balance. And then you have Kathy Allen, and she really is just such a wonderful thinker that I really, really, I think it was episode number 2, but she's challenging us, do an audit of the theories that you're teaching. Are they whole system frameworks? And any theory implies that you can control the outcome as a theory whose time is past. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know. I mean, so I think controversial. I mean, I'm sure some things have been said where certain factions of listeners didn't agree. And I think that's hopefully we can create that space for dialogue. But I think for me, it's these large systems level. And Mary Ulbean, that conversation around complexity, Willie Donaldson around complexity. I still don't have a grasp of that whole area. I just don't.
Have you thought about changing up some of the formats so that maybe you did have a panel discussion or just an open conversation versus, interviewing an expert, so to speak?
Yeah, I would totally be open to it. I think it's, Barbara Kellerman sometimes nudges me and says, "Okay, where's this going, Scott?" And so, and I have to say to her, so I don't have that clarity yet. I'm still kind of searching and trying to, I guess, in some ways, Josh Lindblom, it was a wonderful conversation. And he said, leaders sometimes are kind of 2 steps ahead in the fog. And that was a phrase he used that just really stood out in a nice way. But it's almost as if I'm still trying to kind of figure out the corners of the room and feeling my way around the topic and getting to some saturation. So I feel like I have a lot more of that in me. But I have thought, Jonathan Reams and I recorded an episode this morning. It'll be out in the next episode, where he kind of did an adult development 101. And that was really cool to just hear. I mean, I would love to hear Susan Komovaz talk about, give her lecture. I mean, that would be really
Hmm.
cool. Or Ron
Hmm.
Riggio or Bruce Avolio to hear how they talk about transformational leadership. That would be so cool. And so there's these, or Ira Chalef talking about how he does a 1 hour talk on followership. That would be awesome.
What's the Greek word for essence? Maybe that's the new series.
Ooh, you see, now you're taking me to like Greek again.
You can go Latin too if you want, I guess. Or, maybe we actually expand it out from the Western canon, get away from the Greek and Latin.
Well, yes. Yeah, which takes us to Shelley Spiller. I mean, there's a quote that she said on the podcast, which just really, that was one of those moments that just kind of, she said, I adamantly believe we cannot shoehorn indigenous leadership theory into Western theories. I mean, there's just a whole other way of thinking that I don't know that we in the West have an appreciation for. I don't mean that in a mean-spirited way. I haven't been exposed to it. I don't, but I'm excited to. But again, that's a whole nother nook and cranny. I mean, I just told you, I know not enough about adult development. I know not enough about complexity theory. I know not enough about indigenous ways of knowing, right?
I think we might be establishing
so I got to
a new
stay
title.
curious here, Tony.
Do you have a couple of sleeper awards? So in your ongoing quest to expand your perspectives and your horizons and peek into these nooks and crannies of leadership application and such, are there some episodes that you heard and then they just kept rolling around in your head? You just kept thinking about them and seeing them differently.
I don't know that I don't know if I would use the phrase sleeper in that, but there are episodes that I keep coming back to in my mind. There's phrases that people have used, and maybe we can get there.
Sure.
Quotes. You had one of those quotes that just really frame how I see things now. Just those moments that I was like, oh my gosh, wow. But there's episodes, again, Josh Lindblom, MLB pitcher who had a pitch come back at him. And I think it might have been in his 6th or 7th season, didn't have a college degree, and literally has spent every season doing undergrad, grad, and now started a Ph.D. And so he will play a game because he works second shift, 3 to 11, and go home and write a paper in the hotel room. Wow. I mean, it's just, and he was just dropping little phrases throughout that episode that just really, really, and while we stay on the theme of baseball, the Cleveland Guardians baseball team, they went through a name change, and unfortunately they just lost to the Yankees recently.
Sorry about that.
But that conversation with Brian Barron about kind of stepping into that space of engaging and changing the name, and he knew exactly what he was walking into. And you know what? He is just an incredible, incredible leader, and that was just such an interesting display of someone stepping into something that is better for the whole, more sustainable, a long-term decision, but a decision that he knew would inflame certain factions of people, but doing, I think, the right thing and making a difference. And I think that was a really, really powerful conversation. And going back to Shelley Spiller, again, that quote that she used about not shoehorning indigenous leadership theory into Western theories, the best they can do is kind of illuminate some aspects. Well, wow, that tells me there's a whole world there. And she was talking about how a river in New Zealand had been granted personhood and had the rights of a person. And so it's just I'm so excited to learn more about Maori culture and other indigenous ways of knowing. I've had a few folks on the podcast who helped me better understand some of that. And then there's other people that have been doing the work. So Beth Zemsky, she has been an activist in the LGBTQ plus community since the late 70s and has just been engaged in that work, and powerful, powerful stories. Or Sarah Safari, who, for listeners, please listen to that episode with Sarah. I just got Sarah. She's in Nepal. We're hopefully going to record something in the next couple months because she, she's had some new adventures. And there was a wonderful, powerful, horrific documentary that was just released on Netflix called Aftershock, which is a story about the 2015 avalanche that she speaks of in our episode. And this is now a visual representation of that. So, wow. I mean, some of these people engaging in this work, and there's real danger there. Gail Hickman talking about how she wants to sit on the stool at the diner because she can now, and not telling her parents, but wanting to do that. I mean, just powerful stories. But anyone doing the work, right? I mean, those are kind of the stories that really stand out for me.
As you interviewed some of these practitioners, clearly you chose them for a reason because of their impact or because of some of the things that they may have said or approaches that they're taking that are interesting or unique. Did you find at certain points that they were finding illumination in the conversation? They became a more reflective practitioner because of their presence on the podcast?
Well, I think for some of them, the mission is so front and center that I don't know that they necessarily identify as, quote unquote, a leader. I mean, I think probably cognitively they do, but I don't know that they take on that identity. And so it's interesting. They're just passionate and they want to make a difference, and they're willing to put in the time to make that difference. Does that make sense?
That is a huge insight for leadership educators right there, right? To say, look, at the end of the day, after all these activities and all these theories and all these little wisdom drops, what's your passionate vision? What are you going to go after? What's going to drive you? And you'll find a way around the different obstacles. You'll find a way to bring in the maximum value of the individuals working with you and the communities working with you. That's really fascinating.
I was having this conversation with someone recently. It was in the middle of the pandemic, and my family was around the dining room table, and we were having dinner again because we had dinner every night and lunch and breakfast. But it just kind of came to me. It was like, look, we're all kind of placed on this earth, and probably three things. Can you find your place? Can you find your people? And can you find your passion or your purpose? And some of us are not dropped in the best of spots, and we have to go on this search to find some of those three things. And I think oftentimes, I don't know, I mean, it'd be really interesting to research is part of the challenge we have around anxiety and some of the challenges we have from a mental health standpoint, because large factions of people don't feel like they're surrounded by people, a place, or a purpose that helps them thrive and live into who they should be. So when you talk with these people where there's just jet fuel, Sarah is willing to climb the 7 highest summits, the first Iranian to climb the 7 highest summits. And she doesn't identify as a climber. I hope she does now, but she's kind of done it. But she's passionate about women's equality and helping Nepali girls live a better life and become educated. That's her thing. And she raised $1 for every foot that she climbed to help support them.
Let's drop some wisdom here.
Okay.
So you've been talking about how all these folks have been
some practical wisdom, Tony, or
some practical wisdom. Yeah. So
okay.
Let's talk about some wisdom drops. We'll divide it up into some different segments here, and let's start with aspiring leaders.
Okay. What I say to aspiring leaders?
What would you say to an aspiring leader? Somebody who is, let's say, a high schooler or undergrad, or somebody newly moving into a leadership position.
So I would say read Jay Conger's book, The High Potentials Advantage. That would be one way of answering that question. I would also encourage them to systematize their learning. How are they staying in a continuous place of learning and development and growth, right? Yep, you're holding up High Potentials Advantage right now. I love it. I love it. Fascinating conversation with him. But I think systematize your learning and have that be one of the first things you read or listen to.
Systematize your learning. I love it. What about veteran leaders? Because we get a lot of folks who, they hit a point in their career where they're ready for the next level.
The Marshall Goldsmith, what got you here won't get you there. Are you staying in a place of learning and staying curious about some of the data that's coming back at you so that you can stay agile, stay nimble, and adapt to go to some Ron Heifetz there? Are you engaging in adaptive leadership, or are you kind of stuck in your own predefined ways of being? That's what I
You,
would say
you,
to the veterans with confidence.
you do realize you're going to have about 800 links at the end of this podcast for people to go back and look stuff up.
No, they're going to have to dig.
How about just general leadership practitioners? So not brand new, not veteran, just everyone in the middle management gang.
I said this a little bit earlier. Some of my favorite conversations. Sarah Safari, she's a woman with this intense passion, but she's a PhD. And I think that's a powerful combination. So for practitioners, spend some time with some scholars, learn some of that leadership theory. There's some really, really cool stuff out there for you to engage with. And I think this podcast is a nice primer for some of that knowledge. And for scholars, I think they need to spend more time with practitioners. I think we are too far from the work. I'm saying in quotes, the work. Imagine if physicians weren't actually in hospitals doing research. They were just kind of off to the side. I don't know that would be as effective. And so
I'm anticipating a collective.
Well, it just makes no sense. And so I think as academics, we aren't embedded in the context enough, and we aren't close to the work some of the time, which I think personally is where we create space for places like Gallup, KPMG, McKinsey, to enter that space. They have PhDs, they have people doing research, they know how to create a beautiful marketing piece, and they, in the minds of practitioners, become more relevant at times. Not always, but at times. And so are we staying close to practitioners and the work?
That's some great wisdom. So
was it practical wisdom though, Tony? Was it practical?
It is, but now I'm going to go uber practical on you. So, I'm new to Florida and we just moved here 3 months ago, and I've had a pretty steady series of contractors to the house to do a variety of jobs. And I love to chat with these folks about what they do, where they're from, what they, how they got into it. And I'm probably distracting and annoying them, but many of them belong to Chamber of Commerce, or they belong to like guilds, I guess we'll call it, for lack of a better term, where they help each other out with all sorts of not just referrals, but management challenges. And I wonder what kind of wisdom we can offer basically the small business owner, the small contractor, the individual who's not part of the corporate massive structure where they have their own built-in training systems and can pay tens of thousands of dollars to bring in experts, or the individuals who are so embedded in this field, like scholars and leadership educators. That's the critical mass of individuals who find themselves in a leadership position and may not know it.
Yeah. May not identify as a leader, may not identify as, yeah. So is the question there, what would I recommend to them?
Yeah, a little wisdom drop for that group. Or maybe we're not there yet.
Well, no, I think, my grandfather was an electrician in Iowa at Hormel, and he didn't have a high school education, but spent his whole life working at Hormel and made a good living, and voraciously read Time and Popular Mechanics. And we would walk around their house and there would be those types of magazines, and he was voracious about his learning. He was curious. So again, whether it's a podcast or whether it's audiobooks that you can listen to in the truck or as you're doing your work, I think there's so many opportunities, and so much learning has been democratized. The challenge is it's almost overwhelming, the amount that's out there. So where do I begin? But if you begin with things like with individuals like Adam Grant or some other folks of that nature, you mentioned Dan Pink, there's some interesting folks who I think are doing a nice job of translating, like you said, and dropping really important nuggets, whether you like to read or listen, short form, long form. There's just a lot out there that I think is accessible.
So I know we're coming up on time here. So let me ask you two last questions. What's trending? What's the next thing in the world of leadership that's going to help practitioners, help educators, help researchers, given what you've talked to individuals about?
I think I don't know that this is trending, Tony. I feel like I'm not answering any of the things that have your phrasing in it. Maybe I'm being a politician right now. I'm just kind of turning around and answering the question I want to answer. But I don't know that this is trending. I think it should be a trend. And there's an article by Leroy in the Journal of Leadership and Organizational Studies recently called Walking Our Evidence-Based Talk, The Case of Leadership Development in Business Schools. And it's by Leroy and a whole bunch of other authors, but it's a little bit of a taking to task. If you look at the top 25 colleges of business, you can see leadership. It's more of a marketing kind of term than it is a true commitment to developing leaders at times, not always, but at times.
Not at Florida.
Not at Florida, other schools, right? But again, I mean, it's like we create pilots and then having one class on piloting.
Right.
Right. And so I don't know. It's just interesting. I mean, and I get that people could be defining what makes a leader in different ways and all of that. But I really do think, how are we justifying the billions of dollars that are being spent in corporations, in higher education? And are we really truly working to build initiatives that are evidence-based and that are gathering data to help us learn? And that's hard work. I mean, that's longitudinal studies. That's really, really intentional design from an adult learning perspective. That's mixed methods. It's quantitative, it's qualitative. But are we upping our game when it comes to our talk, right? That should be a trend. That should be a trend. And I'll make sure that there's a link to that article, or at least the location of that article in the show notes, because I think it's important. I really do. And we're doing a little bit of that in the collegiate leadership competition. We're dipping our toes. It's not enough. But who's really going to break through and start doing some really cool work that really starts to, in a robust way, show growth, show development, right? And from a few different lenses, right? Not only cognitive, but skill-based, humanistic.
Well, and at the individual level and the organizational level, team level. Interesting. Yep. So last question is this. What's next for Scott Allen, podcaster extraordinaire? 150 episodes.
A phone call with the student at 3:00. So we got to get off in 4 minutes.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the exciting life of Scott Allen, leadership educator.
That is what's now. Now I have 3 minutes. No, I mean, I think I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep on keeping on. Obviously, with everything opening up, it's a little bit more difficult to prioritize the 4 hours, probably a week, that it takes to record, produce, show notes, transcript. I mean, I put it in a system and it gives me a transcript, but it's, that's a half-hour project in and of itself just to get it to a B. So,
well, good enough is the great, Scott.
No, it's been a lot of fun. And, Tony, again, like some things that people have said have just, it's been so much fun. It really has. And we didn't get to it. Maybe we'll do that for episode 300, but there's just these nuggets, whether Chip Shoba, who said, look, this is a mountain without a top, this was personal development domain, or you saying, I don't know better, I know different. And when you're talking about how you enter the space with your students, just love that. Or Sean Hanna saying, look, ethics is a team sport. Oof. Wow. That's just such a cool. Or Doug Lindsay, he shared with me that Bob Hogan quote, who you are is how you lead. There was a session the other day I was in at an organization in my community, and I gave that quote, and someone looked back at me and said, oh, we could also say how you lead is who you are. And I kind of went into this time warp. I was like, ooh, I don't know if that's different or the same thing. I'm trying to figure this out. Robert Livingston, one final quote. I mean, it was just, this one just, we were talking, his book is called The Conversation, and it's really in many ways about how we discuss important, critical issues, especially around like racism and such. And he said, when it comes to performing mental gymnastics, most of us are Olympic athletes. And wow, how true is that, right?
Wow. Yeah.
How true is that? I mean, so it's just
Our natural capacity to take what we experience in the world and fit it into the way we see the world.
Yep.
I mean, we are Olympic athletes at that.
Yep.
Which leads to all the biases that get us in trouble.
Yep. Well, Tony, I hope this has given you something of what you were looking for.
I'm sure this gave the listeners lots of interesting directions to think about. And, honestly, you have done a lot of hard work for all of us. You've done all the hours of listening and transcribing and posting so that we could benefit and we could take this and the field further and make a difference. So thank you, sir. 150, congratulations.
Thank you. I'll see you at 300. Want to do it again?
Check is in the mail.
Okay, my friend, it's 2:59. I gotta get going.
Take care. It's good talking to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
There is not a ton more to add to that episode. I guess maybe a heartfelt thank you that you have made it this far, that you have joined me on this journey of having conversations with very, very interesting people from all over the world. And another heartfelt thank you to Tony. As I mentioned, just a great friend, a mentor, and a co-author. We have a textbook coming out, a second edition of a textbook coming out with some colleagues, Mindy McNutt and Jim Morrison, in February 2023. I think that's the date. So thank you to Tony so much for taking the time to have that conversation. And staying curious. I looked it up. Eager to know or learn something. And something I know about you is that you are that. And thank you for staying curious. Thanks for checking in. As always, thanks for listening. And thanks for being a part of this process of better understanding this phenomenon we call leadership. It's something so much fun to be curious about because it's all around us and it has such a major impact on our world. And if we can better understand it, and if we can better understand how to help people be more effective when serving in these sometimes gnarly, challenging roles, maybe we can help the world be a better place. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Be well. See you next time. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.